How many times have you avoided looking within because you weren't sure if you could handle what you'd find there? We all carry parts of ourselves we'd rather ignore. Emotions, desires, and memories that don't seem to fit the image we want to project to the world. Yet, these parts don't disappear. They hide, waiting for a moment of silence or vulnerability to surface. What are these shadows that live within us? They're more than just repressed traits or mistakes from the past. They're fragments of our identity that we've rejected out of fear or shame, like a house with a basement we avoid opening. We carry untold stories that shape our choices, thoughts, and relationships. Carl Jung once said, "We don't become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." That's exactly what we're doing here, shedding light on the parts we usually leave in the dark, not to erase them, but to understand and perhaps embrace them, because confronting your shadow isn't a battle. It's an opportunity for self-discovery. So, what's stored in the quietest corners of who you are? Picture a suitcase stored in the basement of a house. It's there, forgotten, accumulating things we don't want to deal with. Old photos, broken objects, fragments of stories we'd rather not tell. That's how the shadow within us works, a space where we hide everything we deem inappropriate, ugly, or unwanted. But just like the basement is still part of the house, the shadow remains a part of who we are, even if we don't like to admit it. The shadow, according to Carl Jung, is the part of our personality we don't want to be. It starts forming in childhood, in those moments when we realize that not everything we are or do is well received by others. Maybe you were scolded for showing anger, crying too much, or being too curious. Gradually, we learn what's acceptable, what deserves to be in the living room of our personality, and we push the rest into that basement. Have you ever noticed how uncomfortable it is to see someone openly expressing anger? That feeling of, how can this person act like that? Might say more about you than about them. Perhaps it's a reflection of the anger you suppress. That's how the shadow shows itself, projecting onto others and irritating us because it reminds us of what we don't want to see in ourselves. Could the behaviors you criticize in others actually be pointing to something you'd rather avoid in yourself? That's the shadow. A quiet, uncomfortable, and sometimes frightening reflection of who we truly are. It's not something we consciously create. On the contrary, it's a buildup of layers. Each reprimand, each criticism, each societal expectation that shape the version of ourselves we show to the world. And yet, everything we push into the basement is still there, waiting for the moment to be rediscovered. Recognizing your shadow is like descending into that dark and dusty basement from the earlier metaphor. At first, you hesitate, fearing what you might find. But when you turn on the flashlight, you begin to realize that the chaos isn't as frightening as it seemed. It's challenging, yes, but also liberating. After all, how can you organize something you don't even know is there? The shadow doesn't scream, it whispers. And one of its favorite ways to get your attention is through intense emotions. Those reactions that feel disproportionate. You know those moments when you're angry at someone over something small, but the feeling seems much bigger than the situation. Or when envy suddenly flares up, and you try to hide it from yourself. These are the traces of the shadow. Try this simple exercise. Think of 3 recent situations that deeply irritated you. Maybe it was a coworker who always tries to control everything, a friend who can't stop bragging, or even someone online who posted something that outraged you. Now ask yourself, why did this bother me so much? Often, what we criticize in others reflects what we're trying to suppress in ourselves. Recognizing your shadow is the first step toward integrating those hidden parts. Is it uncomfortable? Absolutely. But it's also an act of courage. Ignoring these clues is like walking through a house filled with broken mirrors. You try not to look, but they still reflect distorted fragments of who you are. Even our dreams can be allies in this process. Imagine those nightmares where you're being chased by a monster or lost in a maze. These seemingly chaotic symbols are expressions of the shadow trying to communicate. And what if, instead of running, you ask the monster what it wants to show you? Now think, what would happen if you directly faced what you're trying to hide? It might be uncomfortable. Yes, but it's like turning on the flashlight in the basement. Only with light can you organize what was lost in the darkness. We all have a monster within us. It's not the grotesque being that horror stories describe, but a powerful force we often ignore out of fear of what it might do. Here's an uncomfortable truth. Running from this monster is like abandoning a source of untapped energy. It might be scary, but it also holds precious treasures. Think of characters like the Hulk. The Green Giant represents repressed anger, the uncontrollable side that Bruce Banner tries to suppress. Yet it's the Hulk who saves the day, proving that even the parts we fear in ourselves can become our greatest allies. And what about Venom from Spider-Man's universe? Peter Parker only finds balance when he acknowledges both the dangers and the power of this dark entity. Jung called this process individuation, integrating the shadow to become whole. Imagine ignoring your creativity, passion, or courage, just because those qualities come from a place you don't fully understand. After all, how many times has the fear of failure stopped you from creating something new? Or the fear of being vulnerable kept you from forming deep connections? Ancient myths also tell this story symbolically. Think about the dragon guarding the treasure. It's terrifying, dangerous, but to reach the gold, you must face it. What if the monster you fear so much is actually a guardian of your greatest potential? How would you treat it? Facing this darker side doesn't mean letting it loose and out of control. It means understanding it, listening to it, and learning to use it consciously. It's the courage to engage with what scares you, instead of simply running away. After all, ignoring the monster within you is giving up the chance to discover what you're truly capable of. The shadow doesn't only live inside us. It reflects in our relationships and social interactions, often without us realizing it. It's as if we carry a foggy mirror everywhere we go, projecting onto others the things we avoid confronting in ourselves. The problem: this projection creates conflicts that could be avoided if we looked inward with greater honesty. How many times have you labeled someone as controlling or selfish without asking yourself if, perhaps, those traits might also exist in you? In some way, take the workplace. For instance, the person you see as bossy might just be expressing a behavior you suppress, like a desire to take charge and lead. What bothers us in others often reveals what we deny in ourselves. This dynamic is as old as humanity. Jung described projection as an unconscious mechanism that shifts our internal conflicts outward. It's like arguing with a reflection in the mirror, without realizing the image originates within you. How many arguments could be avoided if we recognize that sometimes we're not fighting the other person, but parts of ourselves we resist accepting? And it's not just on a personal level. As a society, we project our shadow collectively. Prejudices, for example, often arise from unacknowledged fears and insecurities. It's easier to point at the other than to admit that what we criticize reflects our own cultural shadows. If we recognize these projections, we can begin to transform our relationships. Instead of judging, we can ask ourselves, what does this say about me? By clearing the foggy mirror, we start to see others and ourselves with more clarity. Perhaps in the end, the conflicts we create outside are just reflections of the battles we haven't yet resolved within. The shadow doesn't have to be your enemy. On the contrary, it can be a powerful guide on the path to self-knowledge. But for that to happen, we need to change how we view it, not as something to be fought, but as a part of us that deserves to be heard and understood. It's at this moment that the shadow stops being a burden and becomes an ally. Think of it as a figure sitting beside you, maybe with a serious face, perhaps with an expression of pain or anger. If you could talk to this part of yourself, what would it say? Try writing a letter to your shadow, imagining what it might want to express, and most importantly, what you can learn from it. Ignoring the shadow can be dangerous, as the story of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde teaches us. By trying to completely suppress his darker side, Dr. Jekyll creates an uncontrollable monster. But here's the key lesson: what we avoid will always find a way to surface. Integrating the shadow is an act of balance, a recognition that it also holds qualities that can be redirected for good. Imagine your shadow holds a strength you've yet to explore. Perhaps it's the courage to stand up for yourself in difficult situations, or the creativity you fear using because you're afraid of judgment. What if, instead of fearing it, you welcomed it. Not as a weakness, but as potential waiting to be discovered. Transforming the shadow into an ally is, above all, an act of acceptance. It's listening to its messages and redirecting them toward something positive. Instead of running away, ask, "What are you trying to teach me?" When the shadow stops being viewed as an enemy, it becomes a bridge to freedom and a more complete version of yourself. Facing what you fear in yourself doesn't have to be a lonely or disorienting journey. There are practical tools that can help bring clarity and balance to this process. Turning darkness into understanding. It's like exploring a map. The path may be challenging, but with the right instruments, the journey becomes achievable. One of the most effective practices is journaling. Imagine you're writing to someone who has never met you before, a curious stranger willing to listen without judgment. Record moments when you felt vulnerable, angry, or even scared. Ask yourself, what does this situation reveal about me? What part of myself am I trying to hide? Writing not only organizes your thoughts, but also helps you recognize patterns and messages that were previously hidden. Another powerful approach is meditation. It doesn't need to be complicated or long. Simply sit in silence and observe your thoughts and emotions without trying to control them. It might feel uncomfortable at first, but this space of observation allows you to see your shadow without judgment, like a curious visitor exploring new terrain. If you enjoy using your imagination, try the active imagination technique proposed by Jung. Close your eyes and visualize your shadow as a figure or form. Ask it what it wants, what it fears, and how it can help you. Does this sound odd, perhaps? But many people uncover surprising answers when they give voice to these hidden parts of themselves. How about a more practical exercise? Write a letter to the version of yourself that bothers you the most. Maybe it's the you that feels weak, insecure, or even aggressive. Express how you feel about this part of yourself. Then read the letter as if you were someone trying to understand you. It's a process that requires honesty but can reveal layers you never expected. By engaging with these tools, you're not just confronting the shadow. You're inviting it to become an integrated and valuable part of who you are. Remember, the greatest fear we have is of ourselves, but facing it is the first step toward freedom. Confronting the shadow isn't an act of aggression. It's an invitation to discover who you truly are. The shadow isn't just about repressed emotions or the parts of us we avoid. It's also an immense source of creativity. Many artists, writers, and musicians have found inspiration in the darkest parts of themselves, creating works that resonate deeply with others. It's often in pain, fears, and doubts that the most powerful ideas emerge. Think of Sylvia Plath, who transformed her inner struggles into poetry, or Van Gogh, whose emotional intensity painted masterpieces that still move us today. These artists delved into their personal abysses and brought to light a beauty that might never have existed without their confrontation with their shadows. But you don't need to be a celebrated artist to use your shadow in the creative process. Have you ever thought about how your frustrations or insecurities could turn into something meaningful? A drawing that captures a difficult feeling, a song that reflects a vulnerable moment, or even a story that gives shape to your fears. Creating is giving voice to what might otherwise remain trapped within us. Why not try something now? Grab a pen and paper and draw or write about something that scares or troubles you. Don't worry about the outcome. The goal isn't perfection, but expression. Imagine your shadow guiding this process, revealing what it wants you to see. When you transform pain into art, something magical happens. It ceases to be just a burden and becomes a means of connection. Your vulnerability, expressed creatively, can touch others while helping you better understand yourself. So, if you could turn your pain, fears, or doubts into art, what would it look like? Perhaps it's time to find out. Accepting the shadow is like unlocking a prison door. You didn't realize you had locked yourself inside. It's the moment when you stop spending energy trying to hide what you don't want others, or even yourself, to see. And when that happens, you experience an almost unfamiliar sensation: freedom. Think about how often you've tried to seem perfect. Maybe it's at work, pretending to always be in control, or in relationships, hiding your insecurities to avoid looking vulnerable. Isn't that constant effort exhausting? By accepting your shadow, you let go of the need to mask your imperfections and allow them to become a part of who you are. without shame or guilt. This doesn't mean glorifying your flaws or letting repressed emotions take over. Accepting the shadow is about recognizing that you don't need to be perfect to be whole. When you embrace your imperfections, something incredible happens. The people around you feel more comfortable being themselves too. After all, who hasn't felt a sense of relief upon realizing they're not alone in their imperfections? Accepting the shadow is like letting go of a backpack full of stones you didn't even realize you were carrying. Imagine how much of your energy is being spent hiding something that, in truth, could set you free. And more. When you stop fighting against yourself, you discover a sense of peace that doesn't depend on external approval. You're not just light, and that's not a problem. It's what makes you human. When you understand this, there's nothing left to hide. You realize that true strength comes from being wholly yourself, unafraid to show both your light and your darkness. It's curious how, in our pursuit of happiness, we often ignore the parts of ourselves we consider troublesome. We think that to be happy, we need to eliminate what's difficult, painful, or dark. But the truth is, ignoring the shadow creates a void. It's like trying to plant flowers in only half the soil, without accepting all the earth. Beauty can never fully bloom. Think about someone who seems to have it all: success, status, stability. On the surface, they appear happy. But inside, they feel an emptiness they can't seem to fill. Often, this happens because the happiness they're chasing is disconnected from their essence. They may be pursuing ideals imposed by others, or trying to escape parts of themselves they don't want to accept. True happiness doesn't come from ignoring our shadows, but from integrating them. When you accept every part of who you are, the good, the challenging, and the parts you don't yet fully understand, you begin to feel a sense of wholeness. It's like realizing that for a song to be beautiful, it needs both high notes and low. So, ask yourself, could the happiness you're seeking lie in accepting what you're afraid to face? By doing so, you'll discover that your shadow isn't a barrier to your happiness, but a gateway to a more genuine and meaningful life. Happiness isn't about living without shadows. It's about learning to walk with them, understanding that they're an essential part of who you are. And when you do this, you'll see that you don't need to be perfect to be happy. You only need to be whole. Life is a constant dance between light and shadow. Just as the day needs the night to exist, we too need our dualities to feel complete. Accepting this truth means understanding that we're not defined only by what we show to the world, but also by what we quietly carry within. Light, with all its clarity and brilliance, gives us direction. It represents our virtues, talents, and everything we aim to nurture. But shadow, though less obvious, is equally essential. It is the night that lets us rest, the darkness that makes us appreciate the flame, the contrast that adds depth to our stories. Ask yourself, who would you be if you weren't afraid of your shadow? Perhaps a little freer, more human, more authentic. After all, when we stop running from what we fear, we discover that strength doesn't lie in eliminating what's difficult, but in learning to coexist with it. The journey of light and shadow isn't about choosing one over the other. It's about accepting that both are part of you, like two sides of the same coin. By confronting your shadow, you not only uncover who you are, but also what you're capable of. Facing what you fear in yourself is the first step toward discovering your true strength. In the end, it's this balance between light and shadow that makes you complete and extraordinarily human. If you've made it this far, I have something important to say to you. First of all, thank you for taking the time to follow this video. It's thanks to people like you that I find the strength and motivation to keep exploring and sharing these deep topics. Reading comments where I see reflections, questions, and even how the content resonated with you. It fills me with gratitude, knowing that, in some way, this work touches someone and brings a positive contribution is what gives meaning to it all. It's not always easy. Along the way, I encounter constructive criticism that helps me improve, but there are also harsh words that sometimes weigh heavily. Even so, I want you to know that everything I do here comes from a place of love and the best intentions. Deep down, what I hope for is to help, inspire, and perhaps open doors to new perspectives. When you take a moment to share something kind, to connect with me and the content I present, you're not just valuing my work, you're showing me that I'm not alone in this journey. So, thank you. It's because of people like you that I keep going. Thank you for existing and for being a part of this. I hope this content has helped you in some way. And if it has, know that the credit is yours too. Together, we grow.